Okay, so I got a question the other day about whether or not 90-degree wrist extension was something that's an important prerequisite for the handstand. And what I want to talk about is just kind of a counterpoint, maybe a separate line of thought, maybe a little bit dark, but I think it's worth hearing for a lot of people. So, this idea of hard prerequisites. And a lot of teachers and masters and gurus use this idea of a hard prerequisite to control their students, to keep them in the system longer, and to kind of discourage this idea of independent progression. And they make the students believe that they're not ready. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't respect the progressions. I think that's a really important part of all of it. But this idea, like I said, I'm just going to use that example of the 90-degree wrist extension. I've never had a 90-degree wrist extension, active wrist extension, right? Put this phone down. Fuck. Try not to break everything. So I've never even had close to a 90-degree active wrist extension. I need to figure out what to do with this phone. My active wrist extension on my right hand is about there. And my left hand, it's even worse because I've had a lot of injuries and neurological issues. So despite that, I've been able to reach a decent level of handstands. I'm not going to call myself a high-level hand balancer, but I've been able to do some one-arm progressions and presses and planches and all this kind of stuff without ever having a 90-degree wrist extension. Now, I'm not saying that it isn't useful or that you shouldn't work on it, but this idea that you're not ready for the handstand until you can do it. So then when are you gonna be ready, right? What if somebody, the same person, because you respect their opinion, what if the same person told you that you're not ready to walk until you have a 30-degree active hip extension, right? Because that's the safest way to walk, because you use your legs to propel you forward. And if you're compensating with your lower back, then you're setting yourself up for injury. So you have to learn how to do it properly. What then? Are you going to sit in a wheelchair and do your hip mobility exercises until you reach your prerequisite mobility? Or are you maybe going to figure out and find a way to do that, a way to walk despite your limitations and still continue to work on your limitations? And again, this is just one specific example, but I really don't like this idea of a hard prerequisite, and I don't like how it's used in a lot of fitness and martial arts and different kind of circles. So another example, I'm not going to call any names. I'm not ready for front levers because I can't do a 5-minute hollow body hold. Like, well, when are you going to be ready? When are you going to be ready for it then? But the idea is that they stay in the system. And what happens when they're in the system? They're paying customers, right? So or here's another example. Again, I'm not going to call names, but you might recognize it. I'm not even going to show you my lower body stretching protocol until I see you do a 5-minute horse stance. Because until then, you're not worthy. You're not ready for the information that you paid for, because you don't meet the prerequisites. You're just going to have to come back and pay me more and pay me again until you're ready. But then I'm going to tell you something else that you're not ready for. So yeah, same thing with a lot of martial arts. Oh man, I would love to teach you my spinning back kick, but you're a blue belt, and I only teach that to brown belts. So you're gonna have to stay in the system and pay more money until you reach that brown belt level. So it's just a thought. Do you need a 90-degree wrist extension to do a handstand? No. Should you work on your wrist flexibility? Yes. Should you also work on your technique so that the physical attributes become less of an issue? Yes. And I think that's actually more important than the physical prerequisites, and you can work on all of that at the same time. But what I don't like to hear, what I don't like to be told, and one of the reasons why I stay away from a lot of these kind of organized whatever fitness religions is that idea that I'm going to tell you what you can and can't do. I'm the authority. You're going to listen to me. You're not ready. And then as a student say, oh, you're right. I'm not ready. I shouldn't even try that. Again, I'm not saying you shouldn't respect the progressions, because progressions are important, but yeah, another handstand thing. Oh, until you can balance for 2 minutes, you're not ready to do tucks or leg patterns. I'm not saying it's a wrong way of thinking. I'm just saying it's a limited way of thinking, and you as an individual might have to get around that because you might be working for years on your 2 minute handstand, and then you might get bored of the training and it might not bring you joy anymore, and then you might do your your Marie Kondo thing and and expunge it from your life. So what's the point? The point is hard prerequisites. If somebody tells you, and I'm not saying they're wrong, I'm not saying I'm right either. I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm still learning as I go. But if somebody tells you very strictly, you can't do this because of this, I don't know. I think it's worth questioning. I think it's worth questioning because there's a lot of people that have very strong front levers that don't even do it in a hollow position. There's a lot of people that do handstands that don't have good wrist extension. Because here also, let me show you just with that 90-degree wrist extension example. So my active wrist flexibility is pretty shit. I used to play piano, I used to play musical instruments, then I did more grip training. I don't know what it was like before then. I've injured this wrist and this hand a lot, and I have a neurological issue going on with this hand, so I have even less wrist extension. But, I appreciate that. So look what happens when I put my hand on the floor. That's a decent wrist extension. Not amazing, but that's more than enough to do a handstand, because handstand I would be doing here. Now also look what happens. I can activate my wrist flexion with quite a bit of power. Even at the end range, look at my wrist extensors. I still have full activation and full control. Even in my fucked up left hand, right? You can see the wrist extension's not as good. I can still activate the flexors and push down. I can still activate the extensors. So even though I don't have the active range outside of the handstand, I clearly do have the active range inside of the handstand with my hands on the floor. So again, I'm not trying to tell you what to do. I'm not trying to tell you what's right and what's wrong, why my way is better than somebody else's way. It's not. I have my own perspective, and some people might enjoy it, and some people might enjoy somebody else's perspective. But it's just a question. Ask questions. This goes for more than fitness. I'm not going to get into that part of the story, but yeah. Asking questions of why. Why do I need a 90-degree wrist extension? Not in a handstand in order to do a handstand. Is that related? I don't know. And then I guess the follow-up question as well that I got earlier today, and that'll probably be the last thing that I address in this live because I didn't want to stay on for too long, is if you don't have a 90-degree wrist extension, does that increase your chances of injury? I don't have the scientific data to tell you yes or no. There is definitely a benefit to having more wrist flexibility if you are planning to start or continue a handstand practice. That being said, I think technique is more important. I think how you do the handstand is a lot more important than your physical prerequisites, because again, you can have all the wrist flexibility in the world, but if you're doing your handstand like this, yeah, it's good that you have flexible wrists, but you're doing it in a way that's putting more pressure on them. So you're probably more likely to get injured over the long term. But if you have shit wrist flexibility, you do your handstands like this with a vertical arm stack where you're not putting as much weight into the hand, then you're putting yourself at a lot less risk of injury because the way you do the skill is not putting as much stress on the body. And that's a technical thing. That's a perspective thing. That's not something that's dependent on the flexibility of your wrists. So that's a huge factor to consider. And I think it's easy to blame the physical prerequisites, if that makes sense. It's always a lot easier to say, oh, I'm not strong enough, I'm not flexible enough, because it's more simple, right? It's an easy solution. But the reality is you may have to change your technique, and that's probably going to do more for you than getting more flexible or getting stronger. Maybe. Who knows? Who knows, right? Again, this is just my perspective, some ideas. And then let's say one more factor, one more thought about that is, okay, let's say, so I have pretty shit wrist extension, but on the floor I have decent wrist extension. Let's say I have pretty bad wrist extension on the floor as well. It only goes to here. Well, then I have to be a little bit more clever. I might have to do my handstand in a way that I'm resisting a lot with my forearms to not compress the wrist. I might have to have my shoulders maybe a little bit further back behind my hands to open up the wrist angle. Or maybe I don't even do handstand on the floor, right? Maybe I do it on parallettes or on rings. Rings is a little bit of a different animal, or even on decline blocks, because when I do that, I can do it with a more neutral wrist angle. So there's always solutions. I just don't like this idea of telling people they're not ready to do something.